Really? Good evening, everybody. Welcome back. Take your Bible and turn to Revelation, and we are in chapter 8 right now. I'm going to try to raise this just a little bit because I don't want to look square up my nose at everybody. There we go. That's a little bit better. Okay. We had touched just briefly last week the beginning of chapter 8, the opening of the seventh seal, silence in heaven for the space of about half an hour. I think Brother West makes an excellent point in writing about this when he talks about the fact that sometimes folks, as he says, major in minors and minor in majors on things like this. The significance of the half hour of silence is in the contrast between the opening of this seal and the previous seals. The fact that the opening of the other seals had been greeted by various sounds and praises and so forth. Here you have just not even crickets chirping, silence. It's a dramatic break. Half an hour, the significance of half an hour is it's not long. It's a short period of time. In this circumstance, think of this as being like taking a deep breath, just here it comes, because things are going to change after this seal is opened. Back in Habakkuk chapter 2 and verse 20, we find the admonition, the Lord is in his holy temple, let all the earth keep silence before him. This is the calm before the storm, before judgment just is rained down on those who oppose God. Now, some of the commentators will look at this as a delay of judgment, but others will see it just a pause for dramatic effect. If it's a delay, it ain't much of one. It's very, very brief. And that's when we consider that the mine or the quarry out of which John draws his symbols largely seems to be Ezekiel and Daniel in the Old Testament. What time periods does Daniel deal with in presenting the ideas there, for example? Daniel is dealing with days and weeks and years. Here you've got half an hour. So it's not much of a pause. It's not much of a deferment if it is that. More likely this is dramatic effect. So I saw the seven angels who stand before God, the seven trumpets given to them. Another angel came and stood at the altar with a golden censer, given much incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar before the throne, and so forth. So, at this point, come on in, brother. At this point, we're preparing for something. We're being gotten ready for something. Now, West makes the point here in his notes, and it's worthy of thought at any rate. An interesting little tidbit that the apocryphal book of Tobit, I believe it's chapter 2, makes mention of seven angels of the presence of God, seven angels who stand or who serve in his immediate presence, and gives names for them. Consider the source. It is an apocryphal book. It's interesting, and the names correspond, at least in a couple of cases, Michael and Gabriel, with known biblical names associated with angels. The others, Raguel and so forth, Raphael and what have you, no biblical precedent for them. Where would this information have come from in Tobit's time? Now, bear in mind, apocryphal books, one of the characteristics of apocryphal writings is that they are typically not actually written by the people whose names they bear or who are purported to be their writers. So we don't know with certainty who the author of this book is. Where would the information have come from? No clue. Jewish tradition? Very possibly, very probably. Is it possible that in ancient times there might have been some revelation of information that was not preserved for us? Think about this. Paul writes to the Colossians and tells them, when you're done with this letter, when you have read this letter, trade letters with whom? The Laodicean Christians. Paul had written a letter to the church at Laodicea as well. Colossae, Laodicea, not far apart. Easily understood that there would be cross-pollination between the congregations, connection, communication. You take your letter to Laodicea, you read the letter I sent to them, benefit from it. Where in your Bible is Paul's letter to the church at Laodicea? We don't have it. Is it entirely possible that there may have been information revealed in the Old Testament era concerning angels in the presence of God that was not preserved in inspired texts that make up our Bibles? It's possible. So these names that Brother West mentions, there's no reason to think that these are not valid, not legitimate, but they're not attested from biblical sources. They're attested from apocryphal sources. Now, come on down and you look at verses 3 and 4, another angel. West makes a good point about these 7 angels. They're not the same angels that John has been seeing previously. These are other angels. He describes them as the angels of the presence of God. Here, now we have yet another angel offering much incense along with the prayers of the saints. Bruce Metzger proposes the idea that this silence, this brief period in heaven, is basically a pause for where God pays attention to the saints, to the prayers, where everything comes to a screeching halt for a moment so that the prayers of the saints may be heard. Maybe yea, maybe nay. Do we really want to suppose that God can't pay attention to the prayers of his saints while there are other things going on? Mm-hmm. He who keeps the universe operating, I don't think would have difficulty with that. But regardless, these seals are open, 7 angels, 7 trumpets presented. What's the significance of a trumpet? For ancient Israel, as they're in the wilderness, they have 2 shofarim, 2 silver trumpets. What were they used for?
Announcements.
Exactly. They were used in much the same way that the cavalry used bugles. Think about the Old West movies where you see the little group of settlers or cavalrymen or the drovers, the cowboys that are surrounded by the Indians and just looks like there's no hope. They're about to be wiped out. And what do you hear way off in the distance over the hills? You hear that faint trumpet sounding the charge. And what do you know? Well, the movie's not going to go the way it looks like in this particular moment. The cavalry's coming. Well, that's what the shofarim were used for in Israel. They were communication devices. They didn't have a giant PA system. They certainly didn't have text messaging and email and telephones and so forth. Go back to the books of Leviticus and Numbers, and what do you find? Instructions regarding the use of the trumpets. You sound the trumpets for this, you sound the trumpets for that. The people understand what this signifies. What do we have here? 7 angels, 7 trumpets, information, a signaling horn. Now, I mentioned Brother West in his commentary takes note of the names of the seven angels given in Tobit's apocryphal writing. Robert Taylor takes issue with that in his, if you happen to have his little commentary, it's excellent commentary on the Revelation, says there's no reason whatsoever to identify them with these. Take your pick. We have two names that we know are biblical. It does no violence to the text either way to identify them or not. The point at verses 3, 4, and 5 is that God pays attention when his people pray. God pays attention when his saints pray. The incense is offered with the prayers of the saints. The smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints rises up before God from the hand of the angel. The angel took the censer, verse 5, filled it with fire from the altar, threw it on the earth, and there were peals of thunder and rumbling and flashings of lightning and an earthquake. Another angel, this is in addition to the seven, this is a different one, and he is cannot be identified with the resurrected Christ. You know, go back into the Old Testament, and we periodically encounter someone described as the angel of the Lord. Who is the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament?
Well, we don't know. Some people say it was Jesus Christ.
Okay.
Some people say not.
Exactly. We don't know with absolute certainty, but we have some passages where it seems pretty reasonable that this may be the pre-incarnate Christ. It seems to fit. However, whether that's the case or not, the one thing that we can be certain of here is that this angel is not the Christ. Cannot be identified with him. And the reason is the use of the Greek word allos, another of the same kind. He's of the same nature as the seven. So that's not the Christ. Even if we were going to describe the Christ as an angel in this particular circumstance, he would have to be another heteros, a different kind. He'd be the same as God the Father. Now, go back to the books of Leviticus and Numbers and think about the arrangement of the tabernacle and later the temple. Where do you find the altar of incense? In the tabernacle, in the temple.
In the holy place.
It's in the holy place. It's not out in the courtyard, and it's not in the most holy or the holy of holies with the ark. It's in the holy place. It's inside the first room of the tabernacle structure. It's in front of the veil that separated the holy place from the most holy. But here, where is the altar of incense? The distinction is that in the tabernacle, in the temple, it was located in a spot that was near the area that represents the presence of God. Now, in the tabernacle, in the temple, where is God? Not literally, not in a physical sense, but metaphorically, what area did God inhabit?
The most holy.
The most holy place, the Holy of Holies. Specifically, if you want to be even more particular about it, the mercy seat, the area directly above the ark, between the cherubim, between the angels at the ends of the ark. That's God's seat, not literally, but figuratively. That represented for Israel this. God did not occupy a literal physical space like idols did, but in their minds, that's God's spot. You know, we have our house, but in your house, what have you got?
That chair.
You got that chair, exactly. You got your spot, and somebody gets your spot. They may, even if you're polite enough not to say, you're in my spot, somebody else is going to come along and tell them, you're in Papa Ray's spot. So in their thinking, that's God's spot. Where is the altar of incense? It's close by. Geographically, physically, it's 10 feet away, maybe. But it's outside the veil. The veil separates the Holy of Holies even from the holy place. The veil separates the presence of God from everything else. But where do we see the altar of incense here? It's right in front of God, in a manner of speaking. It's in his presence. It's no longer near God's presence. Now it's in God's presence. There's no veil. There's no separation any longer. You had a comment you were going to bring out.
When Christ died,
Yeah.
that veil
Exactly.
was split.
Go back to Matthew and Mark, and what do they tell us about that veil? It tore from the top to the bottom. There's no way that human hands could have done that in that moment. It was too tall. It was too heavy, too thick to have torn it. The veil of the temple was not a thin little curtain. It was a thick, heavy divider. And to be torn from top to bottom, human hands might have grabbed it at the bottom and tried to pull, but it was too tall to reach the top.
So all that's now that was in the holy place and the most holy, that's all kind of one now. All that's
In a manner of speaking, yes.
all that's in the presence of God.
In a manner of speaking, yes. Where there's no division. There's no separation. What did Jesus do? He opened a new and living way, which is a contrast to the old and what? Think about the Old Covenant, the Old Testament. It is the old and dead way. How so? What does Paul tell us in Colossians chapter 2 that Jesus did with it? He nailed it to his cross. We don't think, we think of that in terms of taking the law, the book, the commandments, so forth, and nailing them to the cross in a sense. But what did Jesus do on the cross?
He fulfilled it, he blotted it out.
Fulfilled prophecy, offered himself. What did Jesus, the man, do on the cross?
Die.
He died. What was the purpose of a cross?
To torment and kill.
To kill, ultimately, to torment as long as we could before that actually happens, but ultimately to end a life. What dies on the cross with Jesus?
Sin. No.
The condemnation of sin, but more specifically, the old law, the power of the Mosaic covenant. So there's no separation as there was in ancient times. There's no veil. There's a new and living way, the gospel, the old way, which died in power, died in authority, died in the flaw of its perfection, is no longer in the way. So we're not separated anymore.
So,
go ahead.
So we, being New Testament priests,
Mm-hmm.
and Christ is our high priest.
Yep.
We have a certain, can we say that we have a presence right now in the sense that, because in the past, the priests were not allowed in the Holy of Holies.
Okay.
But now we have a presence there.
Okay, come on.
We can't approach the throne directly, not as Christ can, but we are there. I mean, we can
But
sit
we can approach the throne directly
through prayer.
by his permission, by his authorization. In the Old Testament, in the tabernacle, in the temple, who actually got to go into God's presence, the high priest, and then only 2 times, 1 day a year, once for himself and once for the people. It's said that when the high priest went in on the Day of Atonement on Yom Kippur, that they would first tie a rope around his ankle so that if somehow he wasn't acceptable, if he died there in the presence of God, they could pull him out and, if he didn't reappear, pull the rope and find out. And then we know we need a new high priest. What does Jesus say? There's a new and living way. We are what as Christians? 1 Peter 2 and verse 9, a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, just like he is prophet and priest and king. But we're not separated by that veil. He's taken the veil out of the way. We as priests, Christians, enjoy a privilege that the ancient priests did not enjoy. We can go directly into the Father's presence. How? In prayer. We can speak directly to him. How? By the permission of Jesus Christ. What did Jesus say to the disciples? If you do what? If you ask anything, how? In my name. What does that expression, in my name, actually represent or signify? What does it mean?
My authority.
Exactly. You remember the old Keystone Cops movies? Some of you are not old enough, David. Enjoy your youth, brother.
I don't either.
The old Keystone Cops movies. The guy jumps up and waves his finger in the air and shouts, "Stop! In the name of the law." What does that expression, "in the name of the law," mean?
By the authority of the law.
Exactly. As a duly appointed, duly authorized police officer, I am commanding you with the authority of the law to stop. Jesus says, if you ask anything in my name, that will I do. That will my Father do. You have my authority to ask the Father. You have my permission to go into the Father's presence and to ask him. So here we have the prayers of the saints coming up before the presence of God, in the presence of God. There's silence during this period until everything is lit, verse 5, and there's thunder and lightning and earthquake and so forth. Incense back in chapter 5 symbolized the prayers of the saints. Here it's added to them. Think about Romans chapter 8, along about verses 24, 5, 6, 7, 8. And what do we read there? Likewise, what? The Spirit helpeth our infirmities. What does Paul tell us about Jesus? He ever lives to do what? To make intercession for us. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, he's described as what? Our mediator between God and man. Equally related to both sides. Fully God, fully man. Able to represent both sides of the equation. The righteousness of God and all of the trial that man experiences. So we come to verse 5. Now we've got incense added to the prayers of the saints, not simply representing the prayers of the saints. And the angel takes the censer and fills it with fire and threw it on the earth, and peals of thunder and rumbling and flashes of lightning and an earthquake. What's that all about? Perhaps, you'll find this in the class notes as well, perhaps it represents intercession on the part of the Christ, intercessory help of some sort, Holy Spirit. But the focus is that heaven responds. We don't offer prayer to God and get no response as children of God. We may offer prayer to God, make our requests known to him, and not get the response we want. You ever pray for somebody on their deathbed to survive and they don't?
Mhm.
That's not the response we want. But don't say God didn't answer your prayers. He just didn't answer the way you wanted. God pays attention to his people.
Mhm.
Go ahead.
Could you talk about prayer just a little bit? Because,
We can talk about prayer all evening, but I don't know how far we'll get in Revelation.
well, you know, in the Old Testament, prayers was given to the high priest. I get them, well, I'm not even clear on this sometimes.
Okay.
When I look at the Old Testament, because I'm not sure where an ordinary Jew could pray directly to God. Now, I know the kings could, but generally you gave your prayer to the high priest, and the high priest took your prayers to God directly. Does Christ do that for us, or does, you know?
You're asking about the mechanics of something that I can't answer. For the simple reason that I wasn't there.
Okay.
Now,
But today,
in
our prayer goes straight,
in
doesn't
this-
go straight to God.
in this respect, in the Old Testament, we know that when the Jew, for example, brought sacrifices for God with his prayers, where did those sacrifices go? They went to the priest, and if they were sacrifices on behalf of the nation, they went to the high priest. And the kings dealt typically with the high priest, didn't they?
Yes.
Did the ancient Jews pray directly to God?
Yeah, because Hannah did.
Hannah did. What about Samson? Samson captured, eyes put out.
Yeah.
He's chained between two pillars, and what does he do? He prays, and there's no priest around to intercede for him. So what is different about our prayers and the prayers of the ancient Jews? Exactly. You've got Jesus interceding for us. Why? We're his people. He's at the right hand of the Father. When I pray, who do I address? Our Father, God the Father. How do I have the temerity, the chutzpah, the nerve to speak directly to the architect of the universe? The Son gave me permission, basically, as a child of God. Now, let's, since we're off track momentarily here, let's pursue this just one little step farther. Even the disciples of Jesus at times come up with this idea. We know that God does not hear sinners' prayers, meaning in the context there, non-righteous Jews, but extrapolated out. How many times have you heard among our own brethren, God doesn't hear the prayers of non-Christians? And yet, what do we find many examples of? God doing exactly that.
Yeah.
Now, the person who prays as a last resort, does God hear that person's prayer?
I would say he hears it, but I don't think he necessarily responds to it.
God knows everything. So in that sense, certainly he hears it. There's nothing of which God is ignorant except the experience of sin.
He responds to it, but he may not respond to it the way the guys or girls praying that they want.
That person, though, that prays as a last resort, Robert Ingersoll debated Alexander Campbell about the existence of God and about morality and righteousness back in the 1800s. Ingersoll was a famous, well-known skeptic. And it's said of Ingersoll, I don't know that it's true, but it's said that on his deathbed, he cried out, God, if there is a God, save my soul if I have a soul. Well, that's pretty much a last ditch, last resort effort, isn't it?
Yeah, but that's
One of the-
that's a discollegiate.
Exactly. Now, here's
What God.
the fine point, as it were. Jesus says, if you ask anything of the Father in my name. What does James tell us in James chapter 1 about prayer? Ask in faith. Well, I prayed about that once, nothing happened. Did you ask in faith? Did you ask expecting? Now, the health and wealth gospel folks, oh, sow your seed faith, send me $1,000 and then God will multiply it. That's the proof of your faith. Show me that in the Bible.
Mhm.
Ask in faith without wavering, confident that God can, not that God necessarily will, but he can. Go back to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the book of Daniel. When you hear this music, you bow down and worship this statue. You didn't do that. I'm going to give you one more chance. And what do they say to King Nebuchadnezzar? If he chooses to, our God can deliver us even from your fiery furnace. But even if he doesn't, we're still not going to bow down and worship your dumb statue. I don't think they said dumb, but
We get the point.
even if he doesn't, they acknowledged that faith is not contingent on receiving the desire of the moment. Faith, genuine faith, persists whether the desire of the moment is received or not, because faith abides in the confidence that God will always do what is right. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? But he didn't save me. But he didn't save my loved one. Can you see things from God's point of view in every detail? Not yet. Not in this world. The judge of all the earth does right, even when I can't see why he does not do it my way. Well, come back over here to Revelation chapter 8. And at verse 5, you have heaven's response to the prayers of the saints. Fire is taken from the altar. It's cast on the earth with incense. Silence is broken now. The half hour, the short interlude, the dramatic pause is broken. Now we're going to go back to carrying out of judgments. Judgments begin again. And who's the target of these judgments? Well, now it's those who are unsaved. And from the perspective of first century Christians, who would be at the head of the list there? Imperial Rome. The folks that are causing them so much trouble. Now, flip over for just a moment to chapter 11 and notice at verse 19. In chapter 11, the last verse of the chapter, then God's temple in heaven was open and the ark of his covenant was seen within his temple. There were flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, an earthquake, and heavy hail. Go over to chapter 16 and verse 18 there, as we come a little farther down the revealing of symbols and signs and so forth. And at chapter 16, at verse 17, the seventh angel poured out his bowl into the air, and a loud voice came out of the temple from the throne saying, "It is done." And there were what? Flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, a great earthquake, such as there had never been since man was on the earth. What's the significance of these symbols?
You know, since we went over that so many times and you just pointed out in those verses, and it sounds like the same thing. Sounds like the same thing that was going on when Moses was on Sinai.
It does sound a lot like Moses on Mount Sinai, but what else does it sound like? When you hear thunder, how can you escape it? It's too late. You've already heard it. When you see lightning, can you unsee it? It's too late. You may feel the prickliness in the air just before a lightning strike. If you ever do, if your hair stands on end, you're fixing to be in trouble because you're too close to where it's going to strike. But there's no escaping it. It's too sudden. Where do you go to escape an earthquake?
Not, just not there.
You want to be anywhere but,
Yeah.
but where do you go to escape an earthquake? You can't run fast enough to get away from it. These images, lightning and thunder and rumbling and earthquakes, it's inescapable. You can't, when God's judgment comes, it's here. It's too late. Take this thought, the inescapability of judgment, and run back to Matthew 24 for a minute. What do we have in Matthew 24? Well, here's Jesus with his disciples. They're in Jerusalem. They're in the temple. Whose temple are they in?
Herod's.
They're in Herod's temple, exactly.
You said
Matthew 24. Now, our friends in the dispensational groups, the Tim LaHaye's and the John Hagees and the folks of that sort, oh, they'll run over here and they'll try to take every single thing in Matthew 24 and try to make it apply to the 21st century and the conflict between the Chinese or the Russians and the Muslims or the Iraqis or the Iranians or somebody, and the US, and maybe they'll include Great Britain or even Western Europe on the side of right. But it's always this cataclysmic, earth-shaking end of time battle and battle of Armageddon. You know,
This is too different.
you just take all the numbers that come up later on in the Revelation for what our dispensational friends want to describe as the Battle of Armageddon, the war to end all wars for all eternity and all this, so on and so forth. If you stood every person there, shoulder to shoulder, back to front, all the way across the plain, you couldn't fit that many people in the plain of Armageddon, the plain of Megiddo. There's not enough land area there for that many soldiers. That ought to tell us something right there. It's not a literal battle. But come back over here to Matthew chapter 24, and what do you have? Jesus and his disciples walking through the, at this point, mostly completed renovation of Herod's temple. Herod is enlarging and beautifying Zerubbabel's temple, which was a poor man's copy of Solomon's temple. Solomon's temple, magnificent. Zerubbabel's not so much because they were poor. Herod enlarges it and beautifies it. It takes 70 years before it's finished, basically. And then it's finished just in time to be destroyed by the Romans. But it's basically largely completed at this point, the majority of it. What a magnificent structure, Lord. Matthew 24, verses 1 and 2. You see these buildings? There will not be one stone left on top of another that will not be thrown down. What? When was the last time that the temple had been destroyed? That was in Nebuchadnezzar's day. And why was the temple destroyed in Nebuchadnezzar's day? Because Zedekiah the spineless last king of Judah. And his false prophets and advisors were treating it like a lucky charm of sorts. Well, as long as the temple's standing, nothing really bad can happen to us. And Ezekiel, over in captivity already, dealing with the elders of Israel there, says, you keep saying, you keep chanting, the temple, the temple, the temple, the temple. And God says, all right, if that's what you're going to do, I'll take your temple away. And sure enough, he did. So Jesus comes along and says, there's not going to be one stone left on top of another. Flashback to Nebuchadnezzar's time, captivity, bad times for God's people. So they come to him at the Mount of Olives. Lord, you remember we were talking about that and you said the temple's going to be destroyed? When's that going to happen? And whether you read this as 2 questions or 3 really makes no difference, because the breakout in Matthew 24 is the same. Now, personally, I see 3 questions here. Some folks say 2. If it's 2 questions, question number 1 is, when will these things be, the not one stone left on top of another, and what will be the sign of your coming? And question number 2, what will be the end of the age, the end of time? Now, in their minds as Jews in the first century, did they in this moment maybe make a distinction between those 2 events? It would be tough for them to see, in their perspective, the destruction of the temple, the Lord's return in judgment, and the end of time. From a Jewish perspective, that would all be one and the same event. Mm-hmm. That's kind of the way it happened in Nebuchadnezzar's day. There was no nation after that. They were captives. But the key is not how many questions did they ask? Was it 2 or 3? And exactly what were the key is how many questions did Jesus answer? So he starts answering at verse 4. See that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name saying, I'm the Christ, and they'll lead many astray. So here's the warning. And then he begins to answer the questions. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, famines, earthquakes in various places. These are just the beginnings of labor pains, birth pains. And all through the rest of this, when you see the abomination of desolation, verse 15, spoken of by the prophet Daniel, get out of town, don't stick around, and so on and so forth. Learn the lesson of the fig tree, verse 32, and recognize that you can tell when these things are fixing to happen. What was significant about the fig tree?
Well, in that season, it didn't produce any figs. So.
Well, and when it did set fruit, it was about to leaf out and bloom. You see a fig tree with leaves, you assume it has fruit because the fruit actually sets before the leaves come out. That's why Jesus goes to a fig tree that's in full leaf, finds no fruit on it, curses the fig tree. It gave every appearance that it ought to have good ripe fruit on it, and it didn't. But all of this, you look down here at verse 33, when you see all these things, you know that he is near, at the very gates. In other words, all of this destruction I've described is fixing to happen. Truly I say to you, here's the money quote, verse 34. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Jesus told his disciples, you guys aren't going to die until these things happen. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my word will not pass away. Now, what does Jesus do? But concerning that day and that hour, no one knows. What's the distinction he's making?
He's making a distinction between the second coming.
Exactly.
And the destruction of Jerusalem.
He's making a distinction between when shall these things be and your coming, which they would interpret as coming in judgment, and the end of time. He is going to judge Jerusalem and Judah And it's coming quicker than they think. It's coming about 25 years down the road, 35 years down the road. But when's the end of time coming? Well, that's another matter altogether. Of that day and that hour knows no one, not even the angels, not even the Son, only the Father. So, and in verses 4 through 35, what does he give the disciples? He gives them an encyclopedia of stuff to look for the impending destruction of Jerusalem. When you see these things happen, this and this and this and this and this and this and this, get out of town. Don't be around, because you won't escape if you're still around. There is a tradition that said that the Christians paid attention, and that when Rome finally laid siege to Jerusalem, that the Christians got out of town, sought refuge in Petra, and that no Christians were lost. Whether that's true or not, we don't know with certainty, but there is that tradition. Here, though, concerning final judgment, the end of time, no warning, no warning signs, no hurry up and get ready. Come back over to Revelation chapter 8. Flashes of lightning, peals of thunder, rumbling, an earthquake. It's too late to get ready at this point. It's too late to run. Where are you going to run at this point? You can't outrun these things. And that's the point of these images, these symbols. So now we're going to start blowing trumpets at verse 6 and 7. The 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared to blow them. The first trumpet sounds in verse 7, and aspects of nature that were known to ancient man, land and sea and fresh water and celestial bodies. These things are affected. The physical universe, the physical world is affected. Notice though, there followed hail and fire mixed with blood, and these were thrown upon the earth, and a third of the earth was burned up, a third of the trees were burned up, all the green grass was burned up. Well, now, if all the green grass was burned up, literally, what would happen to all the herbivores in the world? It wouldn't be a third that were affected. All the deer, all the cattle, all the animals that eat only grasses and grains and things like that, they'd starve. So it wouldn't affect just a third. There is a figure here. We can't lose sight of the fact that these are images, these are figures that John is seeing. Now, this sounds like Moses' plagues, doesn't it? What happened in Moses' day with the 10 plagues? What happened to the river Nile and all the bodies of water other than for the Israelites? It was turned into blood. What do you know about blood?
Well, it's not drinkable, it stinks.
Okay, it's not drinkable, it stinks, you can smell the salt in it. Did you know that human blood contains approximately the same volume of salt as seawater? What happens if you water your garden with seawater? Unless you have a garden made up of coastal grasses and seaweed, you're going to kill it because it can't stand that much salt. You pour out salt and blood upon the earth, what are you doing? You're salting the ground. You're polluting the ground in a sense. So you have images here that would call to mind for Christians the plagues from Moses' time back in Exodus, and tremendous events that happened within their own living memory, earthquakes and so forth. Certainly among the 7 churches, that would register because that whole Western Turkey region is earthquake prone, just like Greece and other parts of that area. But these judgments are limited. And that's the point here. They're a third and a third and a third. Now we'll get down to, or go back rather to the fourth horseman. Those were only affecting a fourth, weren't they? Back in chapter 6, verse 8. Now we've increased the percentage. Now it's a third. It's not 25%. Now it's 33%. Bigger judgment. Look at verses 8 and 9. The second trumpet sounds. Something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea. A third of the sea became blood. A third of the living creatures in the sea died. A third of the ships were destroyed. What is this? We might look at this in the modern wisdom of the 21st century and see in this, oh, that's an asteroid or a meteorite striking and doing all this damage. I mean, imagine what would happen if you dropped a rock half a mile in diameter, even a quarter of a mile in diameter. Drop a rock a quarter of a mile big in the middle of the Pacific or the Atlantic Ocean. What would happen to all of the coastal areas for thousands of miles in every direction? Oh man, tidal waves like this world has never seen, at least not in human memory. But what else would happen? Devastate human infrastructure, power plants and things destroyed. What happened over in Japan with the earthquakes, the Fukushima reactor? You have problems there with things going on. Sea life would be affected. Human life would be affected. Go into Southern Asia, the areas that were impacted by the big tidal wave several years ago. What happens to the land that's inundated by the water? There's destruction, the trees, the grasses and so forth, they're wiped out. But what happens to the actual soil as well? At least temporarily, you can't just go back and replant on it because it's been contaminated with salt. It's going to take time to recover. Now the second trumpet sounds here, and everything seagoing and so forth is devastated by a burning mountain. And like I said, we might think of this, a meteorite or an asteroid or something striking the earth, something flaming. But it says this fell from heaven. A flaming mountain fell into the sea. But what happened in 79 AD at Pompeii? Mount Vesuvius erupted. And where's Pompeii? Well, it's right by the coast. And what was Mount Vesuvius doing? It was smoking and rumbling, but it was also throwing things. Now, just, what was it, 2 months ago? Mauna Kea or Mauna Loa in Hawaii? One of the big volcanoes in Hawaii got to rumbling and shaking and throwing rocks into the sea and throwing ash and lava and so forth. So we could very well have something like that pictured here.
No, we had something like that back in 1983, 82.
1980, Mount St. Helens.
I was looking at that.
And what happened? You know, Mount St. Helens in 2024 is 1,100 feet, 1,100 feet shorter than it used to be, something like that. What happened to it?
The top of it
It blew the top of it off. Now, just mark this down, just sort of file this away in the back of your memory. The area around Mount St. Helens now, it's been 44 years since that volcano erupted. According to the received wisdom of the non-believing scientific community, the non-religious scientific community, it takes millions and millions and millions of years for something like the Grand Canyon or Paladuro Canyon or something like that, to be eroded away by the patient work of water. You go to the area around Mount St. Helens, and what do you find? You find canyons and rivulets and so forth that weren't there 40 years ago. When did the volcano erupt and cover all that area? 44 years ago. 40 years ago, those places, those canyons and things weren't there. Guess what? They are now. And it did not take thousands or millions of years to wear them away. You have evidence there that the changing face of the earth does not necessarily require millions upon millions of years to change. But regardless, come back over here, talk about this second trumpet. Mount Vesuvius had erupted, the burning mountain, things falling into the sea and devastation and so forth. There is movement. The earth is melting away and so forth. What happens to ground when an earthquake strikes? Solid ground sometimes becomes almost liquefied. Exactly. You can't stand on it. Trees and things are swallowed up by it because its structural integrity is interrupted by the shaking of the earth. What did your grandma do when she got ready to bake a pie or a cake and went to the flour bin to dip out some flour? Where did she put the flour before she put it into the mixing bowl? She put it in a sifter. And whether it was the kind with a hand crank and a little egg beater inside, or whether it was the kind with just a screen and a little scraper and you shook it back and forth, what did it do? It aerated it and it broke up any clumps or lumps in it so that you have fine, sifted, powdery flour. Well, that's what happens to solid earth when an earthquake strikes. It becomes like that flour until it can settle back down again. The movement that you see here is very similar to that. Babylon was pictured by Jeremiah as a destroying mountain back in the Old Testament. And in turn, what did the Lord do to it because of that? Jeremiah chapter 51 and verse 12, or verse 25 rather, God destroyed the destroying mountain. What was Babylon's offense, by the way?
Arrogance.
Well, arrogance, but when they went up and destroyed Jerusalem, Jeremiah tells us basically they went beyond what God authorized. They were more cruel, more violent than they were authorized to be. And as a result, God took them away. Now go back into the Old Testament, and the mountain of the Lord contrasted to the mountain of Babylon or the mountain of Assyria or whatnot. What's that imagery represent? That imagery represents a kingdom or political power of some sort, military might. Now we see this burning mountain falling into the water. What's happening to it? Somebody's power is failing. It does huge damage in the process, but somebody's falling from a position of power. The sea is changed to blood. Go back to Exodus chapter 7, the Nile being changed to blood. And yet in all of this, the effect of the devastation is only partial. It's only partial. Now there's a note here in the class notes. The devastation of sea life would injure ancient Rome's shipping and commerce via the port of Ostia, which was served Rome, enough that it would impact everyday life. It would not cause mass starvation. It would be a hardship. Think about the COVID year when you went to the grocery store, and what did you see in the grocery store? Empty shelves. And you rejoiced when you could get a box of generic saltine crackers. You maybe couldn't get your your premium saltine or your Zesta saltines or your favorite name brand, but hey, store brand will do in a pinch, won't they? That's where Rome would be. They haven't lost everything, but they are not unaffected. Come down to verses 10 and 11. The third trumpet sounds, and fresh water sources are going to be fouled by the impact of this. The third angel blew his trumpet. A great star fell from heaven, blazing like a torch, fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is wormwood. We'll come back to that in a moment. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many people died from the water because it had been made bitter. The freshwater sources are befouled by this. What's the significance of a falling star? Think about it in our own language. When someone is on the rise, they're a rising star politically or in Hollywood or whatnot. Nowadays, we're not saying Fayetteville with all the movie studios over there, or Union City, or over at Fort McPherson. But they're a rising star. What happens when they've passed their prime? Nora Desmond, their star is fading, falling, burning out. Well, here you've got a falling star, a decline of great power. Ancient Babylon had been pictured exactly that way, the day star in Isaiah chapter 14, verse 12. What is the day star?
Venus.
Typically, Venus, the planet Venus.
Yeah.
But what's the significance of the day star?
Well, yeah, it's usually blotted out by the sun.
It is. It's washed out. If it's dark outside right now, if we could go outside in broad daylight, bright sunny day, and look up into the sky, would you see any stars besides our sun? Why not? Are they not there?
They're there.
They're still there, but you can't see them because the sun is so bright. The day star, typically Venus, actually a planet, gets its description because it's what? As day begins to break, the sky grows lighter and brighter. What's the day star? It's the last star you can still see before the sun washes it out entirely. All right. Ancient Babylon was called Lucifer in the King James Version in Isaiah chapter 14. Lucifer, by the way, was never biblically a name for Satan. But the day star is pictured as fading as daylight grows, as daylight increases. That name, Lucifer, in the King James Version actually comes from the Latin word for day star. It's never applied to Satan. Wormwood, here's you a bit of trivia. Wormwood is the plant from which absinthe and anise are derived. Anybody like licorice? Folks that like licorice tend to really like licorice, and everybody else absolutely hates it. And typically it's guys that like it, and when you eat it, your wife will not kiss you because she can taste it on your breath. Women tend to hate it, and sometimes it's the other way around. That distinct flavor of licorice is the flavor of anise. It's the same flavor in the bar that's in the little bottle labeled anisette that's added to some alcoholic beverages. But it's derived from the absinthe or absinthe plant, which in its natural state is poisonous. You put it in water, it poisons the water. It's interesting, it was used in ancient times to kill intestinal worms. Take poison to kill intestinal worms. Ancient medicine leaves a lot to be desired.
It worked.
It worked, yeah.
Sometimes it kills the person too.
It-
Kill the worms.
It's one of those, medicine has to taste bad to be good, that kind of thing.
You know, chemotherapy is poison too.
Chemotherapy is poison as well. You're right.
I just kind of wonder about the true benefits of
Yeah.
that in the long and
You,
short.
you have to weigh the benefits against the drawbacks, don't you? Well, the image here is an image of suffering. In Lamentations chapter 3, as Jeremiah is mourning over the destruction of Jerusalem, you see the same kind of sorrow, of mourning of this. Now, wormwood is also a term that Moses uses in Deuteronomy 29 to describe God's judgment on his enemies. They're wormwood, they're idolaters, they're poisonous. And the impact is opposite of what God had done at Marah in Exodus chapter 15. There the water was poisonous and they complained, and God purified the water. Moses threw the tree in and it purified the water. Here it's the other way around. It poisons the water. Now, let's look at verse 12 and then we'll take a little break at verses 12 and 13. At verse 12, the fourth trumpet sounds and everything goes dark, basically. The fourth angel blew his trumpet. A third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, a third of the stars, so that a third of their light might be darkened, and a third of the day might be kept from shining, and likewise a third of the night. Go back into the Old Testament to the plagues on Egypt. What was one of the plagues? Thick darkness everywhere except where the Israelites were. So it wasn't just an eclipse or something like that. By the way, how long does a solar eclipse last?
A minute or two.
It lasts an hour, two.
Okay, we're about to have a major solar eclipse in April in this country. And the area that will be enshadowed starts in West Texas, and the track of it will go across the Great Plains from southwest to northeast and end up, I think, somewhere in eastern Minnesota or Michigan or somewhere like that. And Delta Airlines is actually selling tickets for flights from Texas to wherever it's going so that you can fly in the shadow all the way. And they're selling them out just like that. Well, it takes about 2.5 to 3 hours to traverse that area. And then it's over. What happened in Egypt was not an eclipse because the Israelites were not affected by it. It was described as thick darkness. I've seen solar eclipses, and yes, it's dark, but it's not hand in front of your face, can't see what you're doing. Thick. Here, you have light affected, but not totally taken away. What happened when Jesus was crucified? From noon to 3, darkness over the whole land. But that was a reaction to the impending death of the Savior. What happens here? Total darkness for a third of the time, a third of the area, that the day might be kept from shining, likewise a third of the night. No starlight, no moonlight. Darkness is a harbinger of destruction, a harbinger of judgment, a harbinger of disaster. And you come to verse 13 now. I looked and heard an eagle crying. Some translations could say a vulture or a buzzard, same kind, a carrion bird really is what's in view here. Don't think of national symbol, bald eagle. I heard an eagle crying with a loud voice as it flew directly overhead. And notice what its cry is. Its cry is understandable. Woe, woe, woe to those who dwell on the earth at the blasts of the other trumpets that 3 angels are about to blow. In other words, what's the eagle's message?
Hang on.
You ain't seen nothing yet, folks. You ain't seen nothing yet. Now, the King James in this passage says angel. but the majority of the ancient texts, as well as Latin and so forth, use the word eagle, and modern speech translations, I believe, correctly use that word. Think of it, like I said, though, don't think of it as, oh, beautiful national symbol, majestic and all that. We're talking about a buzzard. We're talking about a carrion bird, something that pecks the flesh of roadkill. And it's that kind of a bird. And the messenger's declaration, the eagle's declaration, you think this is bad? Just wait. It's going to get worse. Worse things are yet to come. All right. It's time to go into chapter 9, but we'll take a break before we do that. Let's break for about 10 minutes. Let me pause the recording. Feel free to talk amongst you. Chapter 9. And see how far we can go. Judgment against a stubborn world. That's what this is all about. So what we have in chapter 9 is God making good on the warning at the end of chapter 8. That buzzard, you ain't seen nothing yet? All right, here it comes. And the judgments that you see here are parallels in a way, just as the fifth seal, the sixth seal, as they got more specific and more intense, the judgments here, the sixth and fifth and sixth, seventh trumpets, they're going to get more intense as well. So the fifth angel blows his trumpet. Angels blow trumpets. Trumpets don't blow angels. About to get that backwards. The fifth angel blows his trumpet. A star falls from heaven to earth. He's given the key to the shaft of the abyss, the bottomless pit. He opened the shaft of the bottomless pit. From the shaft there arose smoke like the smoke of a great furnace. The sun and the air were darkened with the smoke from the shaft, and then from the smoke come locusts on the earth, given power like scorpions on the earth, and so on and so forth. A plague of, call them cavalry locusts, because they look like horses. Their faces look like horses, and they torment the earth. They come out of this bottomless pit, come out of the abyss. Another star falling from heaven. Folks will take this because it is a star fallen from heaven, and they want to run back to Jesus' words in Luke chapter 10, verse 18. The 70 come back, and the apostles tell him about all that they were done, that they had done by his power. And he said, what? I beheld Satan fallen as lightning from heaven. Folks will sometimes look at this star, the fifth trumpet. Oh, well, that's Satan falling from heaven. You get into a problem when you, as we were talking about at the break, you get into a problem when you try to make every symbol, every image apply to some concrete thing in this world, or to some concrete specific biblical event or person or what have you. The same folks that want to go to chapter 8 and verse 10 and say the great star there is the Christ. Now you want to have a great star here. This is Satan falling. It doesn't work. They try to apply. They try to prove too much, and there's a principle in rhetoric and logic that says what proves too much proves nothing. Now, it's worth pointing out here, there is no biblical passage that explicitly, specifically links Satan with the abyss, except Revelation 20, verses 2 and 3. And there, what is the abyss? It's not his kingdom. It's not his dwelling place. It's a holding place for him. He's put into it. He doesn't originate from it. So here, there's no reason to identify this with him in this particular context.
About that, this that you're talking about, is this a whole new place that is now before the end?
We'll get to it in Revelation 20. All right. So here, falling star, typically for that culture, that time, that would tend to represent a decline of great power. Now, back in chapter 8, wormwood, poisonous, impacts a third of the waters. Here, either of these fallen stars, identifying them with Satan, it really doesn't make sense. Who does Satan try to affect? He tries to affect everybody. How many does Satan manage to affect?
Well, many here on earth as well as in heaven.
Well, go back to Romans chapter 3. And what does Paul say in verses 9 and 10? There is none righteous, no, not one. Why? Because we've all been affected by Satan. We're not born in sin, but what happens to us as we become old enough to distinguish between good and evil, what do we eventually do? Temptation is in the world, Satan is in the world. We eventually choose sin. God didn't program us that way, but we eventually make bad choices. There's none righteous, no, not one. So this fallen star, he's given the key to the pit. Can you? In Revelation 20, you find Satan being held in it. Think of it as a jail cell. Would you give yes, I've seen Andy Griffith and I remember Otis. But would you give the prisoner the key to the cell? It doesn't make sense to read it that way. This context shows that that's not the dwelling place. It's not the domain. It's not the kingdom of Satan and his demons and what have you. There are commentators that try to identify this with Tartarus, with place of torment. Some try to identify it with Gehenna. That would locate it in the eternal realm, if that's the case. There's a problem with that, though, because eternity, from our perspective, being humans living on the earth, where is with relation to us? It's not here. It's in the spirit realm. It's think of it as a timeline. Where is eternity? It's on down the road. It's still in our future. In a sense, for those of us on the earth and for these Christians at the end of the first century who are reading this, still living on the earth, eternity has not yet begun. So it doesn't make sense to locate this in the spiritual realm. It's interesting that in Luke chapter 8, verse 31, the place where the evil spirits there do not want to go is where? Into the deep place, into the abyss. They don't want to go there. John sees this foul, dark smoke rising, and it's polluting the air. It's darkening the sky. That's a contrast to the prayers of the saints going up with the smoke of the incense and so forth. Here, I believe the point is the volume of it, the quantity. It's enough to darken the sky, not just off in the distance. Go ahead, John.
Verse 1. And
Yes.
the fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star fall from heaven unto the earth.
Yeah,
Then it says, and to him was given the key to the bottomless pit.
exactly.
The angel.
The angel.
Yeah,
Okay. So the star has nothing to do with it.
exactly.
Thank you. I mean, I'm still amazed that people try to make the star the him.
Exactly. It doesn't say that.
Yeah.
Sometimes the hard passages are hard only because we read into them what's not there. And that's the case
So
here.
it says that we twist and turn.
Yep,
And that's when it becomes hard,
yep.
not when he gave it to us.
There you go. So let's talk about these locusts for a minute. The smoke became locusts on the earth, given power like the power of scorpions of the earth. They're told not to harm the grass of the earth or any green plant or any tree, but only those people who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. They're allowed to torment them for 5 months, but not kill them. And their torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it stings someone. In those days, people will seek death and not find it, and they'll long to die, but death will flee from them. You ever been stung by a scorpion?
No.
I have been stung repeatedly. When my parents built a new house out in the country when I was 10 years old, they had to clear the land for it. And it was a matter of days after we moved into that house that we began to find scorpions, because that area has scorpions, and they came into the house and they found a comfortable spot. And the simplest way I can describe it is you step on a scorpion, and of course his tail is curled up with the stinger right pointing up anyway. You step on him and he's a tough little critter. It doesn't kill him necessarily to step on him. But if you step on him with your bare feet, that stinger feels basically like a red hot needle going into your foot. And it will hurt, and you will hop up and down and holler for a long time.
That's why you wear boots, right?
That's one of the reasons. There you go.
This never happened to me again.
Well, but we're already behind. I'll give you the benefit of just a little bit of the story. When I was a young man, I used to hang my bathrobe off the corner post of the bed. And I would get up in the night if I needed to, and I would put that bathrobe on and go to the bathroom and go more often, go to the kitchen. And
It shows.
3 nights in a row, I got up in the middle of the night, I put that bathrobe on, and wham, I got stung in the middle of the back by a scorpion that had crawled up inside that bathrobe. I killed all 3 scorpions.
Took them 3 nights to live.
So it was not the same scorpion getting me every time. I quit putting my bathrobe on in the middle of the night after that. I figured it was safer that way. Locusts here. What do we think of biblically when we think of locusts? Go back to Egypt, plague, locusts, eat everything in sight. That's a part of the world where plagues of locusts still occur. East Africa, the Middle East, that area, a plague of locusts is hugely bad news, because they're going to consume everything and leave nothing for the animals to eat. They'll ruin a crop of grain overnight so that there's nothing to make bread from. They leave nothing. Even the straw is unusable after that. So you have this image of something that would affect man and beast alike. But what John is seeing here, not just insects. They have the power of a scorpion. Now, the scorpions that I am familiar with from Central and South Texas, they're hugely painful, but they're not particularly toxic. Go down into the Chihuahuan Desert in northern Mexico, and you can find some scorpions there that are not only hugely painful, the sting is toxic and they can kill you. What do we see here? That's the imagery of the scorpion here, to torment, but they're not allowed to kill. They're not interested in vegetation at all. These locusts are not. They're actually forbidden to eat the vegetation. Their only concern is what? People. Afflict the unbelievers. Afflict those who do not have the seal of God. Now, if these locusts were the servants of Satan, nonetheless, they're still what? They're still under God's control. I say that because so many commentators want to try to associate them with Satan. And what do we see here that associates them with Satan?
They had a king over them.
Well, they got a king over them, but who's the king?
Well, that's what they associate with Satan.
That's what people associate with Satan. But where's the passage that says that? It doesn't. Even if they are servants of Satan, they're still ultimately controlled by God. And in the text, there's nothing, no reason for us to make that connection other than the fact that a lot of people with agendas outside the Bible have tried to make that connection. Their impact is not on the people that Satan would want to persecute, which would be Christians, believers. Their impact is on those who are impenitent. They're not sealed. They're not part of God's people. They're affected because they have not repented of their sins. Go back to Romans chapter 1 and 24, 25, 26, 27, 28. What do we have there? They refused to have God in their knowledge. And so what did God do with the ancient Gentiles? He gave them up. Go to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. And there, even addressing Christians, what does Paul say about the world and any Christian that falls in with the world? They persist in it, God will send them strong delusion, a working of error, that they might believe a lie. In other words, God will allow them to experience the full consequences of their sins if they persist long enough, stubbornly enough. By the way, the description of the locusts here parallels Joel's description in Joel chapter 2, verses 2 through 11. They're shaped like war horses. They don't look like ordinary insects. Locusts, let's pause here for just a second. When we talk about locusts in the southern United States, what kind of bugs are we talking about?
Something like a giant flying grasshopper.
Exactly. We tend to think of one of two things. We tend to think either of grasshoppers, or sometimes because of the noise, what are properly called cicadas. And they're harmless, grasshopper. They don't sting, they don't bite, they eat vegetation. They're a nuisance. They can be deafening in large numbers, but they're comparatively harmless. The locusts that the Christians of the first century and in Turkey would have been familiar with are a different insect. They're bigger. They're much more voracious. Like I said, they can strip a field overnight, but they don't sting.
Well, that's a food source too.
They could be a food source. John ate locusts and wild honey, yeah. But here, what John is seeing are not ordinary locusts. How does he describe them? They look like war horses.
Yeah, they got faces.
They have faces. They're crowned with crowns, Stephanoi, victory crowns, not diademos.
They have long hair. And
they have authority. They have men's faces, women's hair, teeth like lion. That it's a symbol.
I've never seen a locust.
It's an image. They're armored with iron breastplates. They're armored like first century warriors. They have tails like scorpions. They make deafening sounds with their wings. Think of a helicopter.
Yeah, okay.
But they're not authorized to kill. They're only authorized to torment, to test. So they're symbols. They're not literal creatures. They're not something whipped up by God to rain judgment on the literal physical earth and people literally on the physical earth. What are they? They're a representation of God's judgment, of divine judgment, punishment, specifically against those who are unfaithful or unwilling to be faithful, those who are the enemies of God's people. Go ahead, Ray, and then John.
Good question. Because I'm studying Balaam. Balaam's nun.
Right.
And a parallel study is looking at God's influence over nature, animals.
Yep.
Jones Well, the rest of it. It's a whole.
The whole series of them.
Right.
Yeah.
Does Satan have any control like that over beasts? The only thing I can think of is when Christ forced the demons out and they went into swine and the swines jumped over a cliff. But I don't see anywhere in there that we see that Satan has any type of.
There's a point well taken here. What power does Satan have over the natural world?
Whatever God gives him.
There you go. And what has God given him? None that we see. In fact, a point might be well taken in the case that you mentioned with Jesus casting out the legion of demons from the man in the Gadarene demoniac, as he's called, into the herd of pigs, 2,000 pigs. Don't send us to the abyss. Let us go there. Well, what effect does that have on the animals? The animals go crazy, run off the cliff and drown. They don't belong in animals. And Jesus did not put them there. What did he do?
He allowed them.
He allowed them to go there. Satan didn't send them there. Jesus allowed them to go there. We don't have the only biblical example I can think of where perhaps Satan was allowed to control an animal would be in the garden,
So,
in the form of the serpent. And even there, did he have control, or was that just a figure of speech to describe his manifestation? I don't know. John, you had a comment or a question.
I was back to the trumpets and warnings.
Yes.
Once again, it's to those people that don't have the seal of God on their forehead. Hey, look, I'm giving you a warning. I'm not
Yep.
taking anything out. I'm not killing you right now.
Yep.
You're gonna be tormented, you're gonna be
Yep.
court, you're gonna be, and it's only gonna last a short period of time. I'm warning you.
Yep. Again, 5 months, it's a comparatively short period. It's
And, that's why I keep on, the revelation to me is, it's all about God wanting everyone to be saved, and he's warning us.
it's all about
Warning
get the message. isn't
Get the
it?
message.
Get the
He gets,
message.
You know,
You know, going back for a moment to Matthew 24. Jesus tells the disciples concerning the destruction of Jerusalem, look for this and this and this and this and this and this and all these things. And when you see these things, get out of town. And then he says, but you're not going to have any warning about this. How does he follow that up? What comes in Matthew chapter 25? 3 things. You got the parable of the talents, parable of the wise and the foolish virgins, and a picture of judgment. And what's the message of the parables? Parable of the talents, the man gives to each servant according to his ability, goes away and comes back abruptly, unexpectedly. 5-talent man, he's prepared. He's used his talents well. Here's 10 talents, Lord. 2-talent man. Here's 4 talents, Lord. 1-talent man. What about the wise and foolish virgins? Get ready. Well, the bridegroom took his time. We've run out of oil. Share yours with us. We won't have enough. You got to go get some more. By the time they get back, too late. What's the message of both parables? Really very simple. Get ready now while you can. Then, when doesn't matter. We humanity fixates on when is this going to be? If God gave you a date you could put on your calendar for Judgment Day, how would you live your life in this world?
until the day before.
You'd live like a heathen until the night before, and at 11:59 on the night before, you'd be scrambling around trying to cram for the final, just like a college kid.
You were saying that prayer that you talked about.
There you go. The point in Matthew 25's parables, the point really in all of the book of Revelation, in a sense, is really very simple. Don't worry about the when. Get ready, and then when doesn't matter. Go back to what is it? Revelation chapter 5, chapter 4, where we see the chapter 5, where we see the saints. Chapter 6, the saints under the throne in verse 9 and 10. The 5th seal was opened. I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the witness that they had borne. They cried out with a loud voice, O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you judge and avenge our blood? And what's the message? What's the response? Rest a little longer. Wait a little longer. God's going to take his own sweet time. You don't worry about how long. God's taking care of you. For those of us still on the earth, get ready while you can. And then when doesn't matter. So come back over here. The king of this plague of locusts is called the angel of the abyss, both in Greek and Hebrew. He's called the destroyer. The Hebrew word is Abaddon, which is destruction. It's called Apollyon, translated into Greek, and has the same basic meaning. And what it shows is that this is not a friend to the Christ necessarily, the king over these locusts, but he is nevertheless under the control of God. Even if he's a servant of Satan, he's still under God's control for God's purpose, not Satan's. Now, those names, Abaddon, Apollyon, they might well, for the first century Christians, they might well relate them to Rome and to Domitian. Domitian had claimed that he was Apollos reincarnated, or Apollos in the flesh. And for those first century Christians, that connection would be pretty obvious. But literal locusts, they're a I don't know what the collective noun for locusts is. They're not a herd, they're not a flock. They're a cloud of locusts. They don't have a defined leader. The swarm of locusts. There you go. A swarm of locusts. There you go. But they don't have a defined leader. They all just act on instinct. There's not there's a queen bee in the hive, but there's no queen locust that I'm aware of. They all act on instinct. This group, this swarm of locusts, has a king over them. And what we have going on here is something at God's will. Now, look down to verse 12. The statement here is kind of a statement by the angel back here in chapter 8 and verse 13. At verse 12, the first woe has passed. Behold, two woes are still to come. It's going to get worse before it gets better. The consequences of sin are always more far-reaching than the sinner expects. Leave me alone. I'm not hurting anybody but myself. That's a lie. The sinner says, just leave me alone. I'm not hurting anybody but myself. That's not true. You're hurting your Father. If no one in this world is hurt but you, you're hurting your Father, who cares about you and cares for your soul. You're causing him pain, disappointment. But even in this world, it's not true that you're not hurting anybody but yourself, because you don't live in isolation. No man is an island. We all affect and impact each other. Go ahead.
Right behind you, that's in our new commerce class.
Oh, okay. I wondered what this was all about.
And yeah, at least they're starting to learn that now, because they need to understand that, as you just said, sin is not about you.
Actions have consequences. Well, let's pretend we're scientifically knowledgeable for a moment. We've got an engineer here that actually is. Law of thermodynamics. For every action, there's what? An equal and opposed or opposite reaction.
Almost.
You just,
In most circumstances.
yeah.
But not all.
Not all.
But generally speaking, you can't do something without there being a consequence. And spiritually speaking, that's absolutely true. There is no action we take spiritually that does not have a consequence. Look down to verses 13 through 21, and we might actually get to the end of chapter 9.
I don't think.
You got 5 minutes, let's try.
No,
Let's be quiet.
That's all right. The
I got a
interaction
question.
in
I
the,
got a question. Once again, I have questions.
go ahead.
Because it's not a serious question, but it is a question, because I've heard people think
Okay.
these things.
We'll go ahead and pick at the scab.
Here it goes. verse 4 says, and it was commanded them, they should not hurt the grass of the earth.
Mhm. Or any green plant or any tree.
Stop at the grass, stop at the grass.
Okay,
Because going back on verse 7 on chapter 8,
yep,
it says, all green grass is burnt up.
yep.
So I've said, well, see, that's a contradiction. How could they, why would they not be allowed to hurt the grass? Because all the grass was gone anyways.
Okay,
And I said, I tried to say, well, time might have passed between, and they said, well, no, because they're written the same thing. I said, I don't know. I don't know,
context, context, context.
but they're not interested.
Because the person asking the question is trying to read symbols as literal
Yeah.
and missing the message. What's the message in chapter 8 about a third of the trees and all of the green grass?
Limited.
It's limited. It didn't affect everything. What's the message in chapter 9? Again,
Limited.
it's limited. In this case, it doesn't affect the grass at all. It's not about the grass. It's about the message. So in verses 13 through 21, the sixth trumpet. Here, the sixth trumpet, the sixth angel blew his trumpet. I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar before God, saying to the sixth angel who had the trumpet, release the four angels who are bound at the gate of the river, or at the great river Euphrates. So the four angels who had been prepared for the hour of the day, the month, and the year were released to kill a third of mankind. The number of mounted troops was twice 10,000 times 10,000. I heard their number. And he goes on. The four angels of the Euphrates and a huge army are unleashed. Well, the four angels seem to be the four angels that we saw back there in chapter 7. There is a voice from among the horns of the altar. Who's under the altar? Those who've been martyred, those who've been slain. Now the army here, add up the numbers, and how many have you got?
2 million.
200 million.
200 million.
That's what 200,000.
Yeah,
100,000.
10,000 times 10,000 twice.
Well, this, mine says 200,000.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
200,000,
2 million.
200,000 crores would be 200 million. You multiply 1,000 times 200,000, you get 200 million. What is a million? A million is 1,000 thousands.
Okay.
So you got 200 million. That how big is the army of
20
China?
million.
The grand total of all American military forces across 6 branches, counting the Space Force and the Coast Guard, reserves and everybody, a few million, couple million.
We only got 300 million in this country.
Only got 330 million in the country. China has over 1 billion. They have millions in their army. What's the point here? You got a huge, huge army. This would equal 2/3 of the American population of men, women, and children combined. It would be an army bigger than the world has ever seen. If you mounted them all on horses and rode them past as a 1 mile wide of cavalry, it would be 85 miles long by one estimate. Now, I mentioned earlier in the class that our dispensational friends want to take all of these symbols and images and bring them all together for a great battle of Armageddon at the plain of Megiddo. Megiddo, the plains of Megiddo, Armageddon. This number wouldn't fit physically. It's not that big a place.
Mhm.
It does not work for their doctrine. Now, what's this business about the Euphrates? The Euphrates was, still is, the main river to the east of ancient Israel. It's in the land of modern Iraq, ancient Chaldea, ancient Babylon, that area. The Israelites, the Hebrews, the Jews, Jewish Christians, they'd be very familiar with it. Number one, that's where they'd been held captive in Nebuchadnezzar's day. Number two, in the first century, every Jew on earth probably still had kinfolks back there, because when Cyrus said, okay, y'all can go home, most of them didn't go home. Most of them stayed put and scattered to the four winds. These people would have been very, very culturally familiar. Even converted Gentiles reading the scriptures, Old Testament, would understand the significance of this. And for the Roman Empire of the first century, this was basically the east-west boundary. That was pretty much as far as their territory went. Now, they traded farther east, and Alexander had taken his troops much farther east. But for the Romans, this was pretty much as far east as the empire went. So it's right on the fringe, on the boundary. These angels come from the east, as far as Rome is concerned. An enemy that comes from outside their sphere of influence, the scope of their power. Well, the Babylonians had come from outside the scope of Israel's power when they came how? For what purpose? Judgment. For Jews, Jewish Christians, I should say, for Christians generally at the end of the first century, Domitian's era, Trajan's era, Christians being persecuted for their faith, the idea of judgment coming from outside. Who do we serve? We serve someone who is outside the empire. Where is our citizenship? Philippians 3 and verse 20.
Okay.
Our ultimate citizenship is in heaven. Now, Paul had dual citizenship. Silas had dual citizenship. We're Romans. We're Christians first. We have dual citizenship. We're Americans. Yeah, but don't be an American Christian. Be a Christian American. Christian first. American second. Or Brit or Frenchman or whatever you happen to be. Be a Christian first. That's where your first citizenship lies. So at this point in history, Rome, the empire, is ruled by individuals who are wicked, who are self-indulgent, who are morally corrupt, and they worked at dragging their society down to their own level. Think about Nero 30 years before. Nero was a rock star to the people. The Senate and the patricians hated him and eventually caused him to abdicate and be murdered, commit suicide. Domitian was not much more popular in some ways, but much more efficient than Nero. The point here is that God is using forces from outside to execute judgment upon those who oppress his people. Now, for Christians at the end of the first century, they would naturally focus on Rome. And historically, who's coming for the Romans at this point in history? Who's going to be the first people to really, really effectively challenge them? Parthians, ancient Persians, basically, from the east. The thing that stands out about the Parthians is that they were cavalrymen, and the Romans had cavalry. Every Roman legion typically had a cavalry detachment. You had about 6,000 men in a legion. You had about 600 cavalry attached to it, but the majority of Roman cavalry were not Romans. They were hired cavalry from conquered peoples, mercenaries basically, because the Romans were tremendous infantry and they were great engineers and artillery that they created, and they had artillery. They had trebuchets, they had catapults, they had things that shot big arrows and so forth. The technology of the Roman Empire is fascinating to study. Military technology was amazing. They could throw rocks a long way, and they could throw burning things a long way.
Yeah, have you ever seen the opening scene of Gladiator?
Yeah, the opening scene of the film Gladiators illustrates some of this.
That's impressive technology.
But the one thing the Romans were not was cavalrymen. And that's just like Genghis Khan 1,800 years later, the Parthians were cavalrymen and heavy cavalry, not just guys on horses, but guys on armored horses. And they were very good at it, and the Romans were afraid of them. Gibbon, who wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, offers three main causes, and I know our time is up, so we'll stop here. Three main causes that the Roman Empire eventually fell. Number one, natural calamities, floods and earthquakes and volcanoes erupting and so forth, that damaged the infrastructure of the empire. Number two, corruption, internal decay, crazy self-focused, selfish people running the empire. Number three, external influences, external invasion, Phoenicians, Parthians, Gauls, Franks, people from outside that invaded and conquered. The description that we find down here in verse 17, he's going to talk about the horses and the riders. I saw the horses in my vision, those who rode them. They wore breastplates the color of fire and of sapphire and of sulfur, and the heads of the horses were like lions' heads, and fire and smoke and sulfur came out of their mouths. By these three plagues, a third of mankind was killed by the fire and the smoke and sulfur coming out of their mouths. For the power of the horses is in their mouths and in their tails, for their tails are like serpents with heads, and by means of them they wounded. West gives some notes about the Parthians and how they armored their horses so that they could inflict damage both coming and going, even weaving into their tails things that would cause injury. But here, the description that John gives does not tally with anything that actually exists in the physical world. John is seeing an image, a symbol, a figure. Even if it did apply in some respects to the Parthians, even if the first Christians reading these words would say, "Hey, that sounds like Parthians over here, Parthian cavalry." Maybe it did. But the image that John sees does not tally with anything that actually exists in the real world. Hal Lindsey tries to make this apply to mechanized infantry, or mechanized cavalry, armor, tanks and armored personnel carriers and things like that. It doesn't, that does not tally with this. The whole purpose of this judgment, though, here's the thing at verse 20. The whole purpose of this judgment, the rest of mankind who were not killed by these plagues did not repent. What was the whole point of the plagues? To try to induce repentance. And they did not repent. Well, that's where we'll stop. We'll look at chapters 10 and 11 next time, Lord willing, and maybe someday we'll catch up.
You'll finish it.
We'll finish by Christmas.
Yeah.
Questions, comments, or thoughts before we conclude? All right, let me stop the recording.